Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have Sarah here from the University of Maryland. It's Assistant Professor of the Department of American Studies, and she'll be discussing the influences of Caribbean cultures, the influences of Caribbean cultures that have had on our Southern foods. So I'm gonna give it away and let you make us hungry for dinner.
Great. Hey, everyone. My name is Sarah Fouts, and I am an assistant professor, and I'm located in Baltimore, but all my research that I'm going to talk about today is based in New Orleans. And maybe before I pull up my slides, I'll just talk a little bit about my background, because, I came about studying food, from a different perspective. And really what I started, or I guess I grew up in Kentucky and in a household that very much revolved around Southern food and things like that. And I ended up working in the town that I grew up, which is Shelbyville, Kentucky. And I worked for a nonprofit as a bilingual liaison. So I was working with Spanish speaking communities and in Kentucky, and mostly they were working in agriculture and tobacco, in those industries. And there was, kind of some tension between the community that was already established in Shelbyville and the new immigrant community. So we were trying to figure out ways to integrate the two, or better kind of introduce like cultural exchanges, etc. And so we thought of a food festival, because there were different restaurants that were, popping up in the city, and different forms of food vending, from taco trucks to brick and mortar restaurants. And so we got the Puerto Rican restaurant, the Guatemalan restaurant, the Mexican restaurants. There were a few of those. There was a Colombian restaurant. There were a couple more. A Salvadoran restaurant, and we got them all and did this food festival in front of a big lawn of a Mexican restaurant in the town. And it was a really big hit, but it got me thinking about what does it mean that all these new Central American and Mexican cuisines, and even South American, are represented in Kentucky, and what does that say about kind of the changing demographics in that region? Around that same time, I got into grad school in New Orleans, and what better place to study food than New Orleans, which is, I'm sure if you've been, you've had the jambalayas and the crawfish, or at least heard about the gumbos, of course. So it got me really thinking about the kind of new arrival of Central American and Mexican foods to that city after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And so that's what really kind of piqued my interest. And I've had the privilege of being able to not only do academic work, but also do more public-facing work. So podcast episodes, oral history, archive projects, museum exhibitions, a lot of different kind of public humanities types of projects with museums and libraries and organizations like the Southern Foodways Alliance, which is how I think Faith found me for this project presentation. So it's been exciting to be able to do these different venues of talking about foods in particular, and especially what I'll talk about today is mostly Honduran foods in New Orleans. And so that's, and how that has reflects the shifting changes in the South, in southeastern United States. So I guess what I'll do is just share my screen and bear with me for just a second. Let's see. I think this will be it. Okay. So I've entitled the presentation for today is the Analyzing Honduran Foodways in Post-Katrina New Orleans. I'm in an American Studies program, and a lot of the research that I do is in the kind of growing field of food studies, which is really exciting. And I'm also the director of our Public Humanities minor. So I do a lot of kind of food projects with students and with community in Baltimore and New Orleans. And I'm hope to be working on a big street vendor project, working with food vendors in New Orleans and Baltimore, kind of a dual project in both places. That's, I have a couple grants out to be able to fund projects to work on that. But right now I'm working on a project that looks specifically about what I'll talk about today, which is these Central American and Mexican foods in post-Katrina New Orleans. Let me see. Okay, so right here, I like to start with the question, what am I thinking about? What's the research question? And that'll kind of help shape the presentation for today. So I have the question, how do Central American and Mexican immigrants use their foodways to reshape or shape the cultural, social, and political context in post-Katrina New Orleans? And this is an image I have that was actually around the corner from where I used to live in New Orleans, and it's not there anymore. It was up there for maybe 6 months, but it was this market in the pretty famous neighborhood of Tremé. And it has all these different dishes represented on the mural, right? So anything from Mexican tacos to pupusas, which is the Salvadoran dish. Then it has pollo con tajadas, which is a Honduran dish, and I'll talk about all these dishes a little bit later. And then it says hot tamales in the right corner. And then in the gray, you see very local New Orleans type dishes. So yakamain, which is an own kind of fusion dish based off like a Korean or a Japanese ramen. And you see hot wings barbecue, icebergs, which is like a Kool-Aid slushy. So I just thought this was such a good representation of kind of the city of New Orleans and all of its influences in these different ways. Let's see, I'm going to skip over that. But what my research started with was really thinking about, because these foods weren't as ubiquitous pre-Katrina, why they emerged, how did they emerge in the city? And it was really with the arrival of Reconstruction workers after Katrina and immediate aftermath, working in disaster relief. So in this time period, I'm gonna give a little kind of background here. When Katrina hit in 2005, over 80% of the city was just devastated, underwater. There was no potable water, no electricity, and groups of volunteers, day laborers, FEMA workers, all came into the city to help clean up and get things, try to clean up to start rebuilding. 50% of those workers were day laborers coming from Mexico or in Central America. And of those 50%, half of them were undocumented. And so you have a lot of kind of workers coming in to do a lot of the really kind of dangerous and literally the dirty work of cleaning out. A lot of the undocumented folks were not allowed to access the foods that were brought in from the federal government. And it was just kind of this, they were kind of banned from some of the aid that was given, a lot of the MREs, meals ready to eat, that were available. And so they were called in, cousins and friends who kind of sold food in other cities, to come in and start selling food to construction workers, because they had money, they were getting paid for the most part for the work that they were doing. They just didn't have places where they could buy food. So you see the arrival of a lot of itinerant vendors coming into the city. So a lot of tamale vendors that were selling tamales out of buckets. A lot of women would come in with like a hatchback car, and they would pop the car open, and in the back they would have all these foods that were prepared in styrofoam, and they would just sell at different construction sites and cleanup sites. And you also see taco trucks coming into the city, which was new after 2005. So it was really kind of these brand new types of kind of foods that were not completely brand new, but newly introduced to the city in these different ways. What I have marked here are the different stars, are day labor corners. And this is where, I imagine you're familiar with day laborers, they're usually men, most often from Latin America, that congregate in front of Lowe's and Home Depots waiting for temporary jobs. And so there were all these different day labor sites that were set up around the city. And at each site were different taco trucks. I have Ezekiel's Lanchera marked here. So you could see how different food vendors would set up where the market was, right? It makes sense. And Lee Circle well, it's been taken down. I think it's being renamed. Was located in that neighborhood. And that's where all the day laborers initially congregated, but then they started to decentralize. They were kind of disbanded from that central area and went to these different spaces. And so at all these stars is where the food vendors started popping up. And to this day, you have different restaurants and taco trucks that still post up in these spots. You also have up here in the top part of this map is City Park, which is a massive city park, and it's where, because there wasn't housing in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, a lot of folks that were working in as volunteers or as cleanup relief workers were camping out in City Park, and so the vendors also went into the park and were selling food in those spaces as well. So it gives you kind of an idea of the milieu of kind of the rebuilding and what I focus on with my work. And I got involved in specifically learning about the day labor sites and these foods, working with a group called the Congress of Day Laborers, and particularly with the guy who's in the top, I guess, in the blue shirt, standing there. His name is Dennis, and he's Honduran. And he didn't drive, so I would drive him around to the different day labor quarters and to organize with the workers to see, if they needed help kind of negotiating their rights to the space, or if they needed or getting kind of wage theft. There was a lot of wage theft cases happening, and just to kind of build worker power at these different work sites. And they also would do different sort of protests in the city as well. So that's how and Dennis is the one that showed me where all, like, in some cases they were kind of spots that were hidden in the back of gas stations, or taco trucks that you'll see in a second that were hidden in kind of clandestine areas. So he's the one that introduced me to all these spaces, and I kind of served as like the gatekeeper to a lot of me knowing where to go for all the good foods here. So here you could see, this is just an image of a lot of the lancheras or the taco trucks, and they're all located right next to day labor corners, except for the one, Taqueria Los Poblanos in the bottom left, is actually much more mobile and much more in the city. The one in the top right is Taqueria Las Delicias, and that one's, you can tell it's like very much hidden back to the left of a Lowe's in New Orleans, almost kind of hidden behind in the brush back there, but that's actually right off of a main road, Elysian Fields, which is that overpass above. And then in the bottom right, you could see Taqueria Falcon, which is located behind the day labor corner. You can see the Superdome in the background. And then in the top left, you see Taqueria DF, which is a Mexican truck in front of Lowe's. And so these are just the different ways in which a lot of these are still, all of them are still open in these areas, and they're still running their food trucks, even, 16 years after Katrina. So they're still kind of these established businesses. And another thing to notice, or for me to kind of point out here, is they're not self-propelled trucks, right? They're trailers. They're not taco, what you think of a food truck where it's self-propelled. These all have to be pulled by a truck. And so that's really interesting when you think about city policy, when I think about politics and food, is, a lot of the trucks, there was new policy passed that in New Orleans that said you have to be a self-propelled truck. You can't be a trailer to be able to get a food truck pass, but all of these trucks had come in before the new policy took place, and they were grandfathered in with the old policy. But even thinking about, what is being deemed legitimate in terms of the city, and a lot of these types of trucks can't exist anymore unless they were here pre 2013. So even thinking about how policy impacts these food and mobility, things like that. This guy is Ezekiel, who's a good friend of mine, and he's a Mexican, originally from Chiapas, then Veracruz, Mexico. And he opened up, he actually started as a construction worker, came to New Orleans after Katrina, right in like 2006, was working in construction and realized that people weren't being fed, there wasn't food, and he joined with his sister and his partner at the time. The two of them were cooking, and Ezekiel would go out on foot selling tamales to the different construction sites, and he had these networks built up with people with whom he had worked. So Ezekiel, and then he ended up, once the city started to normalize operations, police were no longer willing to like turn a blind eye to people that didn't have licenses. And so Ezekiel got his licensing and opened up his truck. And he actually, I think in his prime, opened up 3 in total. And you can see how, like right behind him, there's the image of the Saints figure, the football team. So he's, trying to like acculturation of his food truck into New Orleans, right? He's trying to appeal to not just the Central American and Mexican clientele, but also kind of, showing that he's, a part of New Orleans in this way. And on the left, very faintly, you can see the list of dishes he has. And like I mentioned before, he's Mexican, originally from Mexico. And he has listed there, taqueria, tacos, burritos, quesadillas, tortas, which are all Mexican dishes. And then he has the dish called baleada, Baleadas. And I'll show pictures of those in just a second. But that's a Honduran dish. So you can see even how he's having to kind of tailor his menu to better appeal to the Honduran community, which is actually makes up the majority of the Hispanic community or Latinx community in New Orleans. And I'll explain why that is in just a second too. So, 2 ways in which he's kind of shifting or tailoring his truck to better fit the needs or demands or penchants of the city is with the Saints, logo painted on there, and then this kind of learning to cook these Honduran dishes as well. So Ezekiel makes incredible food. This is an image of a restaurant called Talamar. And if you see behind the bar, the 3 women are Honduran women, a mother and her 2 daughters. There's actually a 3rd daughter who's not in the picture. And she is Elizabeth, the mother, came from Houston to work in cleanup and rebuilding. And she began to realize that people weren't being fed as well. And so she brought her daughters in from Houston. They were working there, and they started selling breakfast to the men at the construction site. So coffee, oatmeal, different types of cereals, baleadas. And then they opened up their own, they actually had 2 restaurants at one point. And so now they have like one of the main like dance halls. They have karaoke, drag shows, and just really great Honduran food as well. And then in another way, so you see the taco trucks and then the restaurants, and then also this is a picture of the Algiers flea market, which is just across the Mississippi River from the French Quarter. And so people, instead of, some people are still selling on the streets like tamales on the corner surreptitiously. Other people have, like an above board taco truck with licensing. Other people have a restaurant. And then these folks opened up in, it's a weekend flea market. And so they have all kinds of different foods that are available within this market. And they're really just kind of makeshift stalls that people have built out on this land. And the land is owned by a Black woman named Angela Dix, who's from New Orleans. And her family, pre-Katrina, had a chicken and seafood place in the city that got completely destroyed by Katrina. She bought this land, which was on higher ground, but the vendors had started selling food already in this area, and they begged her to let them continue selling. And she decided just to go with them and start helping them build out their businesses. So there's places to get your hair cut. They're selling vintage items, thrift items, CDs, music, DVDs, things like that, and then tons of food from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Mexico, So, there's like a wide variety of different foods that are being sold in the flea market. It's called that La Pulga. And so these are just kind of the ways in which people have kind of adjusted in 16 years after Katrina. These are the existing, how people have kind of made space in the city, in the food city of New Orleans, right? Okay, so really just kind of an overview just about the history of Mexican and Central American foods in New Orleans. There is, a lot of my research, I do some oral history research, and then a lot of newspaper research. And out of this paper called La Voz Latina, which was a short run of this Spanish language newspaper that was actually in English and Spanish. And they have all these advertisements of different restaurants that were around during the mid 20th century. And a lot of them are like advertising Mexican restaurants. So you can see Little Mexico restaurant on Canal Street, which is like one of the main thoroughfares in New Orleans, a Rio Grande, a restaurant Mexicano in Nueva Orleans. And you could see, these different types of restaurants. There's a lot that had opened up during that time period of the early to mid 20th century. And then here you see the longer article is Hernandez Hot Tamales is treat to Orleanians. And this is that over a span of from 1920 to about 1960. This is actually from the Times Picayune newspaper, and they are kind of following the career of Bernardo Hernandez, who arrived in New Orleans in the 20s to work, actually in Mississippi to work in the railroad, and then he moved to New Orleans, started working in the French Quarter at a place called La Lune on Bourbon Street, which is now a bar called Oz. And he worked in the kitchen there. Then he ended up, as a side hustle after he'd leave his job at La Lune, he would sell tamales on the street. And one time there's an article about he was arrested for peddling tamales on the street. But then he came to open up his own kind of tamale factory, then his own restaurant with his wife. He married a woman named Rosa, and they together opened up like 3 different restaurants in New Orleans. And to this, their grandkids have a tamale place called Amita's Hot Tamales, where they use their mother's tamale recipe. So you could see kind of this presence of Mexican foods during this time period, but I never really saw the Hondurans. Where is Honduran food? And I'll talk about why that's such an important part. So I mentioned before that the majority of the Hispanic or Spanish-speaking population in New Orleans to this day are Hondurans, whereas versus on a national level or even in Florida, they would be, a very small percentage of the Spanish-speaking population. And the reason here, you can see my clues, is because of the banana trade, and this is what a lot of people attribute it to. So basically, in the early 20th century, you have United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita brands, and then Standard Fruit Company, which is now Dole. Both of those companies had their origins in New Orleans. And so you have, starting with the banana trade, they had their steamship lines, which you can see in the bottom left, were kind of, they were steamships that were transporting the bananas into the different ports. The primary port was the port of New Orleans for a long time until it lost out to Miami and Houston. They were bigger ports that beat New Orleans out. But New Orleans dominated the banana trade. Over a half a mile of docks were just for United Fruit Company for bananas to come through there. And so you can, so these were what kind of laid the early ties between the two places. And so a lot of folks, a lot of executives that were, kind of either management or kind of business, business people were established in New Orleans, as well as kind of more working class folks that came up from Honduras. A lot of Jamaican workers that had gone to Honduras, a lot of Garifuna workers, and had come from Honduras to the ports of New Orleans to also, work on the docks as waterfront workers there as well. So, and those people established themselves in New Orleans. They became, there was a neighborhood called Barrio Limpirda, which is in present day the Irish Channel, if you're familiar with that neighborhood. And they really kind of settled a community there where they had different restaurants, grocery stores, a movie theater. Very much everything was operating in Spanish in this particular neighborhood from around the 50s to about the 1970s. And then by the 1970s, when New Orleans port is losing out to these other places, and there's also kind of a combination of white flight, which included a lot of these Hondurans that went into the suburbs. And so you kind of see kind of this movement of and kind of shrinking of this Honduran population during that time period. One other kind of fun fact that comes out of this banana history is the bananas foster is a, and I'm working on a chapter right now for my book where I'm talking about the kind of history of the banana connections between New Orleans and Honduras. And the bananas foster, the legend has it that Brennan's, which is a pretty famous restaurant in New Orleans, Ella Brennan, I think her uncle or brother had a fruit stand, and he was connected with Standard Fruit, which was bringing in bananas from Honduras. And so she had kind of a surplus of bananas and had a big group coming in, and they're like, we need you to come up with a dessert. And so she, did kind of like a baked Alaska, which was popular during the time. But she soaked the bananas in rum and then lit it on fire, added, cinnamon and whatnot, and some ice cream. And now they have bananas foster, which is still on the menu at Brennan's. So that's kind of one of the local legends of the banana trade, kind of how it's impacted the culinary traditions in New Orleans, as well as tamales. Hot tamales are big in the South, in Mississippi, New Orleans. So, thinking about how these kind of historical traditions kind of still impact the cuisine today, I think is really interesting. But after the 70s, you really don't see as much migration coming from Latin America, from the Caribbean. There is, after the revolution in Cuba, there is, obviously the most Cubans went to South Florida, but some did come through New Orleans as well as kind of refugees, Japan, things like that. So there was some Cuban population in the city as well. But after the 70s, and with the civil wars in Central America during the 80s, there were some people that went as refugees to New Orleans. But New Orleans and Louisiana as a state really doesn't really see the same levels of migration in the 90s that the rest of the southeastern, and by southeastern I mean kind of Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee. That region saw in the 90s with over 300% increase of Latinx or Hispanic migration coming into that region. And Louisiana doesn't really see, they kind of keep low levels around like 2% of people who identify as Latino or Hispanic. And then after 2005 is when you see this major increase, which went from around 5% to around 10 to 11%. In the metro area of New Orleans after Katrina, when all the reconstruction workers came and settled in the city with their families. And a lot of scholars and even people in New Orleans will attribute mostly Hondurans came because they had networks. They had an aunt or an uncle that was already in the city that may have been part of the banana trade. So that's kind of this longer history of Honduran migration to the city. And I think it's important to kind of think about kind of how that shapes kind of present day who comes and who settles as well. And so maybe, kind of to shift a little bit to the question of what are the typical foods? What are typical Honduran foods? And I always especially when I'm teaching, I love starting with this slide because if you speak Spanish, you'll understand the top part. But I'll translate. It says sopas y platillos típicos hondureña, and it's like typical soups and dishes, Honduran dishes. And then below it in English, it says Mexican cafe, American Mexican breakfast lunch. And so this is a sign, a picture of a sign I took outside of a restaurant just north of New Orleans in a place called Abita Springs. It's where the Abita beer is made. And I thought it was just an incredible sign because, I usually have students, interpret what they think it means. And, what we come up with is, basically it's a Honduran restaurant, but people who pass by aren't going to know what Honduran food is, right? So they have to advertise if they want for non Spanish speaking clientele, if they want them to come in, a Mexican cuisine or Mexican cafe or American Mexican food is much more legible to a non-Spanish speaking or an English speaking clientele. So I just think it's really interesting because we don't like if we this was more interactive, I would ask you if you had Honduran food, and maybe some of you have, but most people I hadn't had Honduran food until I moved to New Orleans, and so what is Honduran food? Um, so the main dish in that is kind of like the taco is the Mexico, like a baleada is the Honduras. And I will say that I've gone to Honduras and I went in 2013 and then again in 2015 as part of research for my current book project. And on both those trips, I went and visited the families of food vendors that are in New Orleans. I went to stay with their families in Honduras. So that kind of gave me an idea of, what they left behind, some of the cultural traditions in Honduras, things like that. And so one of these images on the right, I took in of a woman who was making baleada dough, which is just like a wheat tortilla almost. It's just very simple, very delicious, really flaky. And then a baleada, this is a baleada con todo, which is like with everything. And so it comes with beans, egg, cheese, avocado, meat, and it's just folded over. A baleada sencilla would just come with beans, cheese, and egg, I think. And so you could see you would usually maybe have it for breakfast or lunch, but there's some, gas stations we would go to late at night and get baleadas in the back of a gas station. So, really great, delicious, kind of easy, or not easy, but like quick dish that is made. The next one is sopa de caracol, a soup so famous it has a song written about it, a punta song. I think Pitbull covered it even. And this is a delicious conch soup. It's like a coconut base, not too spicy. It has like green banana, yuca, bell peppers, and then the conch meat, and some spices. It's not like spicy like a Thai curry would be, but it's very delicious. I think there's iterations of this throughout the Caribbean, and this would be found in northern coastal Honduras, like in the Tela, La Ceiba region. Next, we have probably one of the most famous dishes in Honduras, which is pollo con tajada, so fried chicken with plantains. So you can see that bed of plantains there. Buried under all of that deliciousness are two pieces of just really delicious fried chicken, bone in, and then on top of that is the cabbage, the aderezo, with the pickled onions on top. Just really delicious. I mean, this would last me 3 meals, one of these dishes, but very, very good. And you could find it in most Honduran restaurants. This is a street vendor named Suyapa, who's a good friend of mine, and she's making yuca con chicharron outside of a Congress of Day Labor meeting. And this is, chicharron with the same kind of sauce, kind of like a Russian dressing on a bed of cabbage, sprinkled cheese, and then there's avocado on the side. And they always come with the pickled onions as well. Pupusas are also pretty ubiquitous in Honduras. It's typically considered a Salvadoran dish, but Honduras shares a border with um, El Salvador, and you could see kind of the different ways in which how it kind of transcends beyond El Salvador. It's just like the cornmeal stuffed with cheese and the curtido and the pickled onions as well. And then tamales and the naka tamales are also, I think it is really interesting to think about, across the Caribbean, there's all kinds of different iterations of the tamale or tamal in Colombia and Venezuela as well. And these are the main difference between the naka tamal, which you'll find in Central America, and the Mexican tamale is the husk. The naka tamales are wrapped in a banana leaf and steamed, and the tamales in Mexico tend to be wrapped in corn husks. And those are kind of the major differences. Obviously, there's what you stuff them with. Is it a corn masa or like a dough? And then, it kind of varies between pork and vegetables or chicken and different types of spices. I talked about this briefly, but I do research in both Honduras and New Orleans. And that's really just to kind of look at how, migration has impacted families, but also to do kind of a comparative look between the two regions. And one chapter I'm looking at today, this is the restaurant in the top left, where I talked about the women who moved from the streets to the restaurant selling food. And then their dad, the father of the family, still remained in Honduras, and he has his own kind of bar and pool hall in a coastal town near Tela. And it was really interesting going to these places. And I write about it as a case study because, both places are really experiencing, have been hit hard with hurricanes. They're also very much part of a major tourism economy that's been very impactful to development projects that have been to the detriment of a lot of the local communities. So it's been interesting, and that because of development, like, a hotel will put in an ecotourism site, a couple golf courses, and they'll really kind of develop out. And that's led to a lot of destruction of the wetlands in Honduras, which has made these areas that were coastal and somewhat protected by mangroves and by wetlands to be much more vulnerable to storms and things like that. So he's seen a bunch of devastation of his previous bar, which is completely, he showed it to me, it's completely buried under sand because of floods that happened there. And then similar things are happening, obviously, in Louisiana with wetland devastations and things like that. So also not only thinking about it on kind of a micro level, but also kind of this more comparative macro look between the two places and thinking about the land itself and development and the impacts in these regions. But that is it. That's what I have, and hopefully that prompts. It was a lot of information, but hopefully there'll be some good questions that come out of this. So there you go.
There we go. Yeah. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I do have some questions, but if anyone in chat has questions, or not chat, anyone in attendance has questions, please feel free to put them in chat or Q&A. Just something to start off, you talked a lot about the food trucks and how they were serving food out of, the trucks that weren't really like the food trucks that we're used to, like food truck festivals and all of that. How has the popularity of the now normalized food truck kind of impacted those type of businesses?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's been challenging because they have, there's food truck trends. There's food truck festivals in all cities, and that really came out of, the early aughts into to present day, where we see more and more food trucks, and these what New Orleans we kind of dub as like gourmet trucks. And so, when the city, which already needed to update its policies towards food trucks, because what they had on the books prior to 2013, 2014 was food trucks had to move every 30 minutes, and which is just, you can't build clientele, you can't let your, people don't know where you're going to be. I mean, and it's hard to regulate that, but you could still be ticketed for some, that could be um, lead to much other things. And so, they just were antiquated policies. So when they updated it, and they had really strong backing from the city council and things like that, but they really didn't consider what, the lancheras, the trailers, and they kind of wrote them out of the policy. So when I went in one case, went with a woman who had invested $15,000 in a food truck that was a trailer, brand new. She didn't know that the trailer was right when this policy turned around, and they denied her to be able to get a food truck because it wasn't self-propelled. And we were pointing to all these examples, trying not to tell on people, but we're like, they're, these are what exists, and this is what this community is used to having. And she really lost on that project, but eventually she was able to get one. But in that moment, we left there devastated. So I think when the city reimagined these policies, they reimagined it in a much more kind of in like a white, more elite, gourmet notion of this idea of a food truck, rather than what was actually happening on the ground. And so that, I think that's been a big part of it. But at the same time, they did kind of liberalize a lot of those policies beyond, except with that exception. So I do think, when there's like a food truck festival in New Orleans, the lancheras don't go. Like, they have their spot that they like to post up at, and then they're going home. They really have their, so they kind of, do their own thing. They aren't trying to follow the trendy thing. And these are the folks you talk about in this presentation. I don't want to speak for everyone, right? But the people with whom I work, that's, usually what they say in terms of that.
Gotcha. And kind of along those lines, I know you talked about how they've kind of changed up the rules and everything. What about, like, I know the food code or how to sell food? Like, nowadays, some people could tell on a little kid who's selling lemonade at a stand. How has all that kind of impacted them a little bit more, or has it impacted them a little bit?
No, yeah, absolutely. There's, it's like the woman who I went with, and she was undocumented, but she was opening the business with like her friend who was documented. And so we were at city council, and the official there said that they don't have enough people to regulate, so they would probably get away with it. And she was like, I'm not gonna risk that. Like, if I get ticketed, that could lead to deportation, etc. So she was a little more, that was something that directly, she didn't want to even risk it, or in such a precarious position. Other people, like, people are very surreptitious in like in their methods of selling food. People still will just show up at day labor corners, in and out, with their like hustle, selling foods out the back of their car, no license or anything. I mean, I've tried to approach people just because I wanted to eat the food and buy it. And obviously I'm curious because that's my research, but they won't even talk. I mean, I'm a white person, and probably, could be like, they don't know who I am. And so, they would, kind of leave because they were afraid that I would say something. So there's still people that are, running their kind of side hustle, just like, I know a lot of folks that do that here in Baltimore, and that do that in New Orleans too. So, but, I think there is, especially for folks who are undocumented, there is a lot more risk to that sort of venture. But it's also, in some cases, like, all they have, because in some cases, you can't access a job in the formal sector. And I think what's interesting is that historically, the case I talked about with Bernardo Hernandez in 1928, I mean, he was arrested for peddling on the street. So it's not, a new thing that is happening. It's been kind of this, we street vending has always been a part of how people get fed and foods.
Especially in New Orleans. I know when I've gone down there for Mardi Gras, you have people selling water for $5 out of a cooler, and I'm like, what? No.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I do think that if you've been to like a second line or things like that, you have like, Black folks that New Orleans that have their like a bar set up in the back of a pickup truck.
Yeah.
Like it's a hustle city. Like people are always trying to, or everyone has their grill out and they're selling foods at like Jazz Fest and things like that. But they've actually tried to regulate it a little more. But it's just, it's a big cultural thing. It's hard to kind of regulate that.
Yeah. It's just a 24/7 tailgate there. No.
Exactly.
I did kind of chuckle. I saw the United Fruit Co. and I had some family members who worked there when I was doing some genealogy research. I saw that. I was like, I know that image. But you mentioned that how the Banana Foster kind of helped influence some specialities in New Orleans. Is there any other types of foods that have helped it, I guess, help ingrained it a little bit within the New Orleans culture from Honduras and the Caribbean and everything?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. I mean, there is like you're from Mississippi. There's the hot tamale, the Mississippi tamale, and there's the New Orleans tamales, which I think the two are pretty similar. So I do think that's more of like, I would say like a Mexican influence because the corn husk is used in the U.S. South. But let's see, what are other dishes that are well, like here's a good one, like the king cake.
Okay.
So and this is a more recent tradition. So on January 6th, which is King's Day, is kind of the initiation of Mardi Gras and Carnival season, and that's when the king cakes in New Orleans start to be available at all the bakeries, and there's all your specialty bakeries. And the Honduran bakeries, particularly Norma's Bakery, which is in Mid City, has done their version. They do it like a guava king cake. So it's stuffed with guava jam. And there's also, I think, a tres leches version of the king cake that is made. So you can see, and like King's Day is very much part of like the Caribbean, Latin American culture as well. So in some ways, it's not that foreign to like to start Carnival. But it is, yeah. But the king cake, I think, is one that's kind of a newer tradition that's been really kind of adapted or culturalized in these different ways.
That's pretty cool to hear because I know that's one thing from in Florida. It's hard to get a good king cake that's not Publix brand.
Oh, right.
And I know if there's some days I'm like, maybe I can ship it out from Gambino's in New Orleans or somewhere.
Yeah. No, and they do ship them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So good.
How many restaurants do you think say that they're Mexican but they're Honduras? Because that was a good point that you pulled out. Because when you asked if anybody had eaten Honduras food, I'm like, I don't know if I have or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean that, how I started, I was talking about Kentucky, and the Mexican restaurant in town is owned by Guatemalan. And that I was like, well, and I think everyone's probably had an experience like that, like even with, a lot of different types of food. But I do think like, a good friend of mine, he's from Veracruz. I didn't talk about him in the image, but he used to work at a Honduran bakery as the head chef there. And he learned to make all the Honduran dishes. But I'm trying to think, I think it's more from the end of people who are like, um, like not like this, not Spanish speaking, and they're going to these taco trucks and they eat the tacos at a Honduran truck, and they think it's a Honduran or a Mexican truck. And I'm like, no, like we sell this truck, she's Honduran. She just learned how to make good tacos, right? So I think you get a lot of, I don't think I haven't seen a Honduran like not really kind of feign as a Mexican restaurant, but they will kind of try to make the dishes to be more kind of better access people who aren't familiar with Honduran foods. So yeah, that's a it's a good question. But yeah, and you see like there's a Mexican restaurant that like that there's the head chef, or they claim to be Mexican, but the owners are both Colombian, and the staff are from Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico. So it's like a bunch of different representations. And, yeah, and it's fun to look at menus and like analyze to what are they selling here? Like there's pupusas on this menu, but then there's all kinds of different enchiladas and Mexican type dishes. So
Well, if no one else has any more questions, we'll wrap it up and everybody can go eat after seeing all that good food and hearing about it. Thank you so much for doing this for us, and we hope to work with you some more in the future. And have a
yeah,
good night.
thank you. Yeah, have a good night. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.